Welcome to another episode of America's Greatest Personalities. This is Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host. In this episode, it is my pleasure to talk to you about two comic legends, a wonderful duo, a team. There will never be another like them. I'm talking about Burns and Allen. Here's a little bit of their life story. Stay tuned. In the series, America's Greatest Personalities, we take a look at some incredible people who, just like you and I, had a dream. And the steps that they took to realize that dream, the things they learned along the way, and the people that joined them on their journey in terms of their passion, their enthusiasm for who they were and what they did, really ended up, in this case, changing the American entertainment industry and comedy pretty much as we know it. I'm talking about George Burns and Gracie Allen. Let's talk about Mr. George Burns first. And since what we're doing here happens to be painting two very unique character portraits, I'd like to start with George in terms of some of the many wonderful things he was famous for saying. The great George Burns once said, "Isn't it a shame that the people who know how to run the country are all driving taxi cabs?" Next up from Mr. Burns is this: "When I was in Vegas, women were throwing their hotel keys at me. Unfortunately, it was after they checked out." George also once said this: "Old age is when you send back the swimsuit issue of Sports Illustrated because there are fewer articles to read." Next up is this. He once said, "Happiness is having a large, loving, caring, close-knit family in another city." George Burns also said, "Age to me means nothing. I can't get old. I'm working. I was old when I was 21 and out of work. As long as you're working," he once said, "you stay young. When I'm in front of an audience, all that love and vitality sweeps over me, and I literally forget my age." Next up, Mr. Burns said, "I lie a lot, but when I write about Gracie, I don't have to lie. The truth is unbelievable enough." And speaking of Gracie, here are things that she was once famous for saying. Gracie once said, "This used to be a government of checks and balances. Now it's all checks and no balances." Gracie also said, "Brains, integrity, and force may all be very well, but what you need today is charm. Go ahead and work on your economic programs if you want to. I'll develop my radio personality." Gracie Allen also said, "When I was born, I was so surprised. I didn't talk for a year and a half." Gracie Allen also said, "A celebrity is a person who works hard all of his life to become known, then wears dark glasses to avoid being recognized." And Ms. Allen said, "It's not that I'm afraid to die. I just don't want to be there when it happens." And she finally said this: "I stand before you tonight a simple, plain woman, which is not my fault, really. The beautician couldn't take me till tomorrow." Here's a teeny bit of a routine between the two. George would say, "Gracie, those are beautiful flowers. Where'd they come from?" Gracie would respond, Don't you remember, George? You said that if I went to visit Clara Smith in the hospital, that I should be sure to take her flowers. So when she wasn't looking, I did. Burns and Allen were one of America's most successful comedy acts for no less than, get this, 29 years. Think about that for a moment. 29 years. That's just short of 3 amazing decades. And that's 3 decades in vaudeville, radio, films, and of course, television. So how do you keep in the biz for 29 years? Let's start with George and his story. George Burns was born Nathan Birnbaum, Birnbaum, Nathan Birnbaum, on January 20th, 1896. He was the 9th of no less than 12 children from New York City, and needless to say, life was tough in those days, particularly since Nathan's father, who was a substitute cantor at a local synagogue, died from the Great Flu epidemic of 1903. Nathan was compelled to help his family under those circumstances and did anything and everything he could to help put bread on the table. This is how he described those years. We were all about the same age, 6 and 7, and when we were bored making syrup, which was one of the jobs that he had, we used to practice singing harmony in the basement. He wanted the whole world, a letter carrier that we knew who would stop by, loved harmony, and he did want the whole world to sing harmony. He came down to the basement to deliver a letter and heard the 4 of us kids singing harmony. He loved our style, so we sang a couple of more songs for him. Then we looked up at the head of the stairs and happened to see 3 or 4 more people who had gathered to listen to us sing, and they were smiling. In fact, they threw down a couple of pennies. So I said to the kids I was working with, no more chocolate syrup. It's show business from now on. We called ourselves the Pee Wee Quartet. We started out singing on ferry boats and saloons and brothels and on street corners. We put our hats down for donations. Sometimes customers threw something into the hats. Sometimes they took something out of the hats. And sometimes they flat out took the hats. As funny as that may seem, that was when Nathan realized that he really had something. That was when he realized what he wanted to do for the rest of his life. Make people smile, entertain them with a little savvy, with a little humor. Why? Because humor heals. So much so did he want to do this that he ended up quitting school in the 4th grade for the bright lights of fame and fortune. Hey, he probably thought when you got it, you got it. Unfortunately, Nathan was the only one who thought that he had it back then. He would do countless amateur shows, but the leap to the big-time vaudeville stage, which was where you needed to go to get experience, to get exposure, to get known, was not easy. Nathan did anything to get into vaudeville, but unfortunately in those days, nothing seemed to work. He was rejected time and time again. He would get a job, but unfortunately he would more often be fired from that job. And that's bad enough, but get this. One of the only surefire ways he could get work was when he changed his name after he got fired and would get hired again by the same manager who had just fired him a while before. Nathan started using a trademark of his at an extremely early age. And I want you to guess what that trademark was. So think of when you would see George Burns on TV. What would he always sport? What would he always have with him besides Gracie? It was a prop. Huh? I think you got it. Of course, cigar. He would always sport a cigar. And this is what he had to say about that. I thought if I smoked, I would look more like an actor. So I started smoking cigars when I was 16, and I have been smoking them ever since. Nathan would soon change his name, of course, to George. There are a couple of different stories as to how he wound up with George Burns, but the most common one is this. There were two Major League Baseball players back in that day that George really admired. One was named George H. Burns. The other was named George J. Burns. So Nathan must have thought, I like both of those. I'm going to take out the middle initials and I will be George Burns. In 1922, George's luck would change. He had a vaudeville partner at the time by the name of Billy Lorraine. So it was George Burns and Billy Lorraine. That was the act that they had in vaudeville. However, things weren't working out between the two of them, and George was in the process of parting ways with Billy. Not knowing where to turn next, guess who he would end up meeting. But before I go any further, a little background information concerning Gracie for you. Grace Ethel Cecile Rosalie Allen, try to say that fast 5 times, had a little easier of a childhood growing up than Nathan did. She came from a rather well-to-do show business family. She was born on July 26, 1905 in San Francisco. Grace left school at the age of 14 to pursue a stage career with her father, who also happened to be an entertainer. Grace began in vaudeville with her sisters back in 1909. The act was called The Four Colleens and featured Grace and her sisters Bessie, Pearl, and Hazel. She ended up leaving the act and wanted nothing to do with show business again. And the act was going great for a long time. I mean, Grace kind of felt like she already had her career on the stage and left show business to pursue. Well, she had to go to school for it first. She went to secretarial school because she wanted to be a secretary. So let's go back to that year 1922 once again, when George's luck would change, when he would meet the one, the only Grace Allen. Burns was 27 at the time. So how, you must be thinking, did George and Gracie meet when she happened to have been in secretarial school and he was teamed up with another partner? While Gracie was in school, she just had this whim, this intuitive feeling that she needed to go see an act that she had heard was breaking up and might just need a replacement. This historic event occurred at the Union Theater in Union Hill, New Jersey. Gracie went backstage that night after she saw the act because she wanted to suggest, get this, that she join Billy Lorraine in his act, since she had heard that George Burns was the one who was leaving. In typical Gracie fashion, she got the information totally flip-flop, all mixed up, and thought that she was meeting and talking with Billy when she was really talking with George. It took no less than 3 days to finally admit to her, George did, that he wasn't Billy and that he was indeed George. But by then, Gracie was along for the ride, a ride she thought she was taking with somebody by the name of Billy Lorraine, when in reality, she was really taking it with George Burns. Gracie decided to stay with the act and to see what happened. When Burns and Allen first started performing together, things were a little different back then. Gracie was the straight person, and George happened to have all of the funny lines. George, very astute that he was, soon realized that Gracie was getting all the laughs, even though she was the straight person asking all the questions, and George was supposed to be the funny person giving all the answers. The audience laughed whenever Gracie would ask George questions and wouldn't laugh when George would have the funny responses, or let's just say allegedly funny responses. So wisely, he changed things around. When the duo started performing together on the vaudeville circuit, they were known as a disappointment act. So what do you think that might have meant? Disappointment act in vaudeville theater. If another act didn't show up, Burns and Allen, because they were so reliable and so good together, would be called to fill in, and fill in they did. They were so reliable that vaudeville bookers started to think of them as a main act and started to book them that way. It also took a long time for George and Gracie to get the cadence and comic interplay between the two of them that they would soon become so very famous for. Many a night they would bomb because Gracie wasn't saying the right things or George wasn't reacting in the right way. But they were both smart enough to let their audiences decide what would work concerning their act and their energy and chemistry together and what wouldn't. That's a great thing when you really think about it, letting your audience decide how to shape your act and not you. That way you are assured success because you're giving the audience what they want. Few people realize that George wrote all of the scripts, which also means that he was the one who created the characters that George and Gracie would be on stage as their act went on, as their careers went on. Few people realize also that when Burns and Allen were performing in vaudeville together, they were not a true couple off the stage. In fact, Gracie was engaged to somebody else at the time, but George soon found out that he was falling in love with Gracie, even though she was engaged at the time. Wedding bells would soon ring on January 7th, 1926. The couple would also end up adopting a daughter by the name of Sandra in 1934 and a son by the name of Ronnie in 1935. The couple would eventually become one of the most popular acts in all of vaudeville, and this wasn't only the case in America, but in Europe as well. While performing in Britain, the couple was asked to appear on BBC Radio. It didn't take too long at all for the world to realize that Burns and Allen were perfect radio material. And what perfect timing, since vaudeville at this point in time was a dying art in America. So they took their vaudeville act and brought it to radio. Same incredible timing, same unique chemistry, same fun and comedy. It was the one and only Eddie Cantor that asked Gracie to appear on his radio show back in the States. And it wasn't long before CBS would offer George and Gracie a contract for their very own radio show. On February 15th, 1932, the couple appeared on Guy Lombardo's radio show, and it would take, get this, less than a year for Lombardo to appear on Burns and Allen's new radio show. The couple's act would be a little different in that singing and dancing would move into the background, because that's also what they did on the vaudeville stage, but comic dialogue, and lots of it, would now take center stage. So really, think of their stuff, their shtick, right? The dizzying lady, long-suffering man routine, and how well that would translate onto radio, and you have more than a winning formula. As a matter of fact, the route that Burns and Allen took to reach fame and fortune was the very same route that so many comic contemporaries of their day would take as well. It was a journey that started in vaudeville, then would go to radio, then in most cases would go to films, and then wind up on television. It was the same story in this way for people like Jack Benny, Bob Hope, Milton Berle, Red Skelton, really just to name a few. The year was 1940. And it was then that Gracie Allen, I did not know this about Gracie. I wonder if you might have. It was then, now they were big stars on radio at this time, right? But it was then that Gracie made up her mind to run for president. Yes, run for president. And assuming this wasn't a grand publicity stunt, it seemed as if she was pretty darn serious about doing that. Think about it. It was 1940. A female announces to the world that she wants to run for president. So picture it. It is 1940, and America happens to just be coming out of the Depression. World War II seems to be looming on the horizon. Who was running for president that year? Any guesses? Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie. This was pretty serious business given the condition and state of our country. George and Gracie were a hit on radio, as I had said, but Gracie was also looking for something that might tie in their popularity of the radio show with the upcoming presidential election. So this is how George tells it. Gracie was sitting in our living room knitting one night, and lo and behold, she stopped knitting, put it down, and said these words. You know, George, I'm getting tired of knitting this sweater. I think I will run for president this year. Gracie's presidential campaign actually began as a joke and was supposed to be part of a two-part script on their more than popular radio show. Her slogan was, "Down with common sense, vote for Gracie." When the gag caught on in the big way that it did, the two decided to extend it for a couple of weeks via their radio show. But then things started to take on a life of their own when Gracie started appearing on other popular radio shows to announce her bid for the presidency. So what do you think the public thought when they heard that Gracie wanted to run for president and wanted their vote? What actually started out as a major publicity stunt was now actually building into a very real, true-to-life presidential campaign. So, on February 28th, 1940, Gracie Allen declared her candidacy for the office of the President of the United States. No joke. This is real, folks. You could tune into their radio show and hear them talk about this. At an early national press conference, Gracie announced that her first official act as president would be to settle the California-Florida border dispute. She was also very proud of our national debt because it was the biggest debt in the world. When asked if she was a member of any party, she simply stated, "I may take a drink now and then, but I never get affiliated." Her party wasn't the Democratic Party. Her party wasn't the Republican Party. Gracie had all of the many particulars worked out, including the name of her party. You know what it was called? The Surprise Party. And get this, when asked if she would recognize Russia, she said, "I don't know. I meet so many people. I don't know." Gracie also said this: "A chicken in every pot is good unless you're the chicken." Allen also refused to nominate a vice president, vowing not to put up with any vice in her administration. Gracie even wrote a book called How to Become President, and believe it or not, the book became an immediate bestseller. And if you think that Gracie was just limited to saying all this stuff on national radio broadcasts, such as the Jack Benny program and others, how about this? Eleanor Roosevelt invited Gracie to be the guest of honor at the National Gala Press Club event that year. And just like any aspiring presidential candidate back in the day, Gracie had her staff arrange a national press tour across the nation by train. They stopped in such places as Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, Las Vegas, Denver, and Dallas, really, just to name a few. And if you think that that's not interesting enough, how about this? There was even a national convention. Yes, a national convention for Gracie's surprise party planned in Omaha. Gracie's train campaign ended in Omaha, where the actual surprise party convention was held from May 15th through May 18th of that year. And by the end of the tour, Gracie was a real presidential candidate. Let the history books record that on May 17th, 1940, I cannot believe this, but it's true, 8,000 delegates nominated Gracie Allen for president of the United States. That convention drew a total crowd of no less than 80,000 people. Gracie's acceptance speech at the convention was broadcast live on NBC. It's amazing. Obviously, she didn't win, but wow, what a ride that must have been. Burns and Allen delighted radio audiences from 1932 all the way to 1950. Films would be next. One of America's most popular couples would make their film debut in 1932's The Big Broadcast. And more films would follow. Lots more films would follow. Few people realize that the famous road pictures of Hope, Crosby, and L'Amour were mostly because of Burns and Allen. The very first road picture, which would be The Road to Singapore, was originally written for Burns and Allen and Crosby. The roles of Burns and Allen would eventually obviously go to Hope and L'Amour. Interesting fact that few people know. Burns and Allen's roles on TV would be the next step and the next huge step. How perfect an act was this to make a mostly seamless transfer from radio to television. And that occurred on October 12th, 1950 on CBS, when the Burns and Allen show became an immediate smash hit all the way through to 1958, from 1950 to 1958. A grand total of 291 episodes would air on TV and would remain in syndication for years to come. How would the show always end? You probably know. Say goodnight, Gracie. Good night. By 1958, Gracie was getting tired of the grind and decided to retire from show business altogether. George would now have to make it on his own, and he soon found out that that was no easy feat at all. He tried to do the show without Gracie, but it would only last a year, if that. After trying another TV series that also didn't take in a major way, George would go on to make occasional appearances here and there for many years. George once said this: "For 30 years, my act consisted of one joke, and then she died." George would lose his true soulmate in 1964 due to heart failure, and it was as if George's heart had failed too. George could not sleep for weeks after Gracie's passing. The only way he allegedly could was ending up sleeping in her bed, not his. Gracie Allen was 62 years young. As you can imagine, it would take George quite a while to get back up on his feet, but as you may remember, get up on his feet, he certainly did, and then some. George was asked to replace his ailing friend Jack Benny in the popular 1975 major motion picture, The Sunshine Boys. George was a smash hit and was back on the board, so to speak. And get this, he happened to have been 80 years old at the time. He was back in such a big way that he won an Oscar for his performance in The Sunshine Boys. 1978 would find him, do you remember this, playing God in the major motion picture, Oh God. And that was so popular that two sequels followed, Oh God Book 2 and Oh God You Devil in 1985. I remember seeing him countless times with Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show, and that was always a very special occasion. George Burns would become a living legend, and like the amazing ever-ready Bunny, he would live to the grand age of 100. He would pass on March 9th, 1996. Many say that he knew when it was time to go. It was then that he allegedly had the following letter dictated: "By the time you read this, I'll be playing the harp with Gracie. I just hope that when the recital is over, they will let me smoke a cigar." Whether he ever said that or not isn't certain, but we do know that the great comic legend was just that, an amazing guy, a truly wonderful guy, as was Gracie, a gal. They were two of the most wonderful people ever in show business, an incredible marriage, a true role model for what a Hollywood marriage should and could be. But even more than that, George and Gracie were two very special people because, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, they knew how healing laughter could be. And as the true comic healers they were, their contribution to the American entertainment industry and to comedy the world over and large will never, ever be forgotten. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host. I want to thank you for tuning in and joining me today. I look forward to seeing you on past and future episodes of America's Greatest Personalities here on Live Life Well TV. Thanks so much, and God bless.